All right, well, welcome again. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Jordan. I'm Senior Charitable Giving Advisor here at the Community Foundation of Greater Des Moines, and we're happy to have you here for our training on reserves, what, why, when, and how much. As our team has had conversations with nonprofit organizations over the last few years, one of the most common trends that we have heard as we've navigated a global pandemic and now maybe an economic recession is that financial statements and our financial picture as nonprofit organizations is looking different. And different means a lot of things. For some, there's excess surplus from the pandemic. For others, it's maybe a different story. And wherever you're at today, we thought this is a really good time to have a conversation around our financial picture and specifically this idea of reserves. So we've brought our friend Sarah Jackson from Propel Nonprofits in to have a conversation with us today. Sarah is a senior leader and financial specialist at Propel Nonprofits. She's been working with and for nonprofit organizations in Minnesota for more than 15 years in various roles, including as executive director of the Minnesota News Council and program director for the Minnesota Newspaper Association. She gained expertise and experience as a nonprofit financial leader on the job, not through traditional means. She wants all of us to know that she does not have an MBA or a CPA on the job experience, and she loves helping nonprofit leaders decipher and understand the often exclusionary language of finance. So as we listen to and have a conversation with Sarah today, we invite you to engage with us through the chat with any questions that you might have. We have some time at the end to field as many of those as we can. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Sarah.
Excellent. Thanks, Jordan. I don't know if you wanted to say anything about Give DSM.
I do.
Before we continue.
Right. Thank you. Just a shameless plug to you while we have the floor. If you're not already familiar with Give DSM, we'd love for you to check that out after the webinar today. GiveDSM.org is a free platform to promote your fundraising needs, whether that's ongoing operational needs or a specific project or a capital campaign. You can learn a lot more about it on GiveDSM.org and through our website. You can take it away, Sarah.
Thank you. Thanks, Jordan. I appreciate that you mentioned that I'm not an accountant or an MBA. So we have a non-traditional group of lenders on our team where I think we have one MBA, but there's like a cultural anthropologist. I came up through journalism. We have someone who studied like political philosophy. So anyway, if we can all, get into the whole nonprofit finance thing, like really anyone can. So I hope if you take anything away today, you just feel empowered to, trust your role as a nonprofit financial leader in your organization. So that is that. I'm going to just tell you, just for anyone who's not familiar with Propel Nonprofits, we are a nonprofit organization ourselves that serves other nonprofit organizations. We are based in Minneapolis, Minnesota, but we serve the whole state of Minnesota as well as the states that surround us. So Iowa, of course, the Dakotas, Wisconsin. And our mission is to fuel the effectiveness of nonprofits with guidance, expertise, and capital. We do that through a variety of programs. We do a lot of capacity building work. We have a lending program that I'm part of. We have some accountants on staff that help folks out with special projects. We have a fiscal sponsorship program, a strategic services program, as well as a training program, which this is kind of part of our traditional training program here today. So it's great to be here and to be talking to an audience, not just from the Twin Cities. So that's cool. We did look up a few rules and notes in Iowa nonprofit law and practice. So hopefully we don't misstate anything as we go through our time together, but there's nothing too specific in that area, but that's great. Just a few notes before we get started. So if you're able to turn your camera on today, that's awesome. I love to have like real people in the room, even though we're in Zoom. So if that's something that is available to you today, that's great. We're not probably going to have time for an official break, but if you need to take a break, fill up a beverage, get some lunch, please take care of yourselves. That is totally fine with me, of course. And just a few notes on questions. So I know Jordan said we'll use the chat a lot. If you have like a quick clarifying question about something we're talking about right now, please, raise your hand or add it to the chat. Both me and my colleague Sheila, hi Sheila, will be following along as we go through the presentation, and then we'll also reserve some time at the end for like some bigger questions. So if you have like if something big comes up, just write it down, or you can add it to the chat too. Sheila will kind of keep track of those as we go as well. So I think the final just notes of, as far as like sharing resources. So I believe that Jordan has either shared or will share the slides with you from this presentation today. So you will get a copy of those. And then we'll be mentioning a lot of resources along the way. I think that's one of the best parts of Propel is just all of the resources that we have on our website that are free and available to nonprofits. So as we come up through some of those, Sheila will share those in the chat, and we'll also share them back to you in a follow-up email. So I think that is all my housekeeping business. Any questions, concerns? Okay, I know you're all here to talk about nonprofit finance over your lunch hour, so let's get to it. It's very exciting. It is though, actually. Okay, well, I would also love to see. So I think that when we were getting ready for this session, we learned that many of you in our Zoom room today are nonprofit leaders. So give me a little one of the icons, like a hands up or a star if you were an executive director of a nonprofit. Yeah, hands up, or you can use the little icon button too. Excellent. Do we have any board members with us today? Hello, Lynn. Excellent. Any development folks? Raising the money to put in a reserve. Okay. If I didn't hit your title, please do feel free to add it to the chat. I'd love to sort of know who's with us today. So that's always fun. Okay. Let's get to it. So why do nonprofits need reserves? I think Jordan just outlined a whole bunch of reasons why we need reserves. There's a lot of uncertainty in the world. There has been, there will continue to be. As we know, we're not quite sure what's ahead of us. And so, there are a lot of potential reasons why we might consider having a reserve in our organization. So one of the questions to ask, of course, and I always think back to like that moment in March of 2020 when the pandemic sort of hit. And I don't know if everything shut down on like March 13th or 14th in Iowa, but it did in Minnesota. And I kind of think of that day as just like, we were all thinking like, oh my gosh, what are we gonna do? Like all of our clients, like revenue is drying up, it's pre-PPP, what do we do? And so a lot of folks that had reserves or rainy day funds or emergency accounts maybe slept a little bit better that week because you knew that there were actions that you could do, there were things you could do. You could sustain the organization with some reserves. And then you might have been in panic mode if you didn't have any reserve because you really didn't know what was ahead over the next couple of weeks. And so one of the things that reserves allow us to do are to really access some of these things. So stability, so being able to pay our bills in that time of maybe sort of panic. But also flexibility to make choices. So maybe during a non-emergency time, if you have some money in reserve, you will have the ability to make choices, to choose the timing of purchases or programs or debuting something new that you might not have if you didn't have reserves. Another thing is reliability. So being to just no matter what sort of the flow of your business cycle is, you would be able to be a reliable partner as far as honoring obligations to employees and contracts and vendors. When you have that little bit of extra money set aside, when bumps come along, you have money to access to pay those things. So you're a reliable partner. And then of course we have resilience. This is like the word of the last, well, it'll be like the word of the decade, I'm sure. But the ability to make it through unexpected or tough times. So we've got global pandemic, we've got inflation, we've got potential recession, we've got all of these things coming up that, that there's just a level of uncertainty that we haven't experienced before as nonprofit leaders. And so Again, having some extra money on hand allows us to be resilient through these times of uncertainty. And then finally, adaptability is really, I mean, it's really similar to resilience, but also in the sense that if you don't have reserves, there comes a point where you don't have options. And so, the options become pay the staff or don't pay the staff, lay the staff off, don't lay the staff off, get rid of the office, don't get rid of the office. But if we have some money in reserve, it would allow us to be a little bit more adaptable, maybe to create a plan B instead of having like the worst case scenario or the best case scenario be your only options. And then finally, durability. So having reserves on hand allows you to kind of be the organization that can make it through all different seasons, all different weather, everything that's going on in the world and still remain stable. There's a reason why, like, Harvard has a multi-billion-dollar endowment. They're always going to be fine, like, I know that's not probably the type of money that we're talking about today, billions in reserve, but that is a historic organization that will be around longer than us, likely. So, what exactly is cash in the reserve fund, or what cash do we put into a reserve fund? So basically, in your organization, you probably have a big pot of money. You have a cash account or a few different cash accounts. And this is the typical, breakdown we'll see. So you have operating funds. These are this is the money you use to pay your bills, to operate your daily business operations, to kind of like make it through things. You might also have some cash kind of set aside or cordoned off that is restricted, either for a specific use as granted by your donor. Maybe you have some permanently restricted funds in an endowment, or you have some that's like set aside for regranting. So you can't really use it in the organization from an operations standpoint. Now, if you have reserves, then you will add this third piece to your pie. So hopefully, and this is really the crux of what we'll talk about today is, you have enough money for operating, you've reserved enough money to meet all of your restrictions or requirements, and then you have a little bit left over. And that is the money that we can start to create a reserve with. And so as we're talking for the next, hour and 15 minutes, we're really going to talk a lot about how do we get to that point where we have this slice left over, and what are some of the strategies we can think about to make sure that if building a reserve is one of our goals, that we are able to do that, or at least begin to plan for that. So let's break it down a little bit more, just talk a little bit about the operating funds piece. So we often refer to the cash that you need for operating in the organization as working capital. So it's not the same as reserves, and it's not really your net assets either. It's the actual sort of liquid cash that you have access to in your organization to pay the bills. So you may have a lot of assets. You may have a building. You may have, you may have just remodeled a beautiful office and have a lot of sort of assets in the form of leasehold improvements, but you can't pay the bills with furniture, unfortunately. So what we like to talk about with clients is really getting to that point where we understand, do we have enough sufficient cash to kind of make it through our cycle of seasonal activities and timing and funding, and really determining with folks how much cash that they need. So this is I think, a part of the budget process, right? Like, how much money are we bringing in? How much money do we need to spend? How do we, what is enough working capital? What is enough cash in our organization to sort of get through each year? One of the tools that we use to determine that is a cash flow projection. So I don't know if any of you are currently using a cash flow projection as a tool. Sheila just popped one of it's probably our most popular resource. We have a template for creating a cash flow projection. So if that's not a regular practice that you have right now in your organization, it can be a really great exercise in kind of figuring out what the cycle of your business really looks like over the course of a year. And then also you'll be able to get in there and figure out the spots in the year where you might have some excess money to put in reserve, for example. So when we project cash flow, and it's really the resource that Sheila shared as a spreadsheet, you plug in all of your expected income, you plug in all of your expected expenses, and really you get to see the bottom line. Do you have cash left over or not? Do you need to figure out a strategy for managing those ups and downs? So when is a cash flow projection particularly helpful? So if you're an organization that has a really seasonal sort of cycle of raising money, so perhaps you are an organization that gets all of your grants in December, or you're like in Minnesota, we have a state arts board and they all pay out in the summer. And so a lot of our arts organizations are like flush with cash throughout the summer, and then they're figuring out the rest of the year. We can see kind of in this cycle here for this hypothetical organization that they manage to kind of be above cash flow, and then they dip negative. So this is part of their cash flow cycle. These parts of the year where they dip below zero might be parts of the year where they would access their reserve fund if they had one, to make sure that they could continue regular operations, to be that reliable nonprofit organization. So that's working capital. So that is the money you always need every year to operate no matter what. What is an operating reserve? So this is a little bit different. This is that extra piece of the pie, the money that we might have left over in our account that we're building, so that when we do have what we just looked at, this dip in operations, when we go negative, that we have cash available to protect and to stabilize our organization and the operations. So if you are following along, if you want to use the chat, what are times in your own business, your own nonprofit, where you might have to access or maybe already do access like an operating reserve? Again, when we talk about an operating reserve, it's really to help bridge those parts of our business cycle where maybe we are in a grant cycle where there's a few months each year where we're not getting any reimbursements from that big grant, or it's a really quiet time for individual donors, or maybe we have to do events completely different now in a pandemic, post-pandemic, almost hopefully post-pandemic world where folks don't want to gather in big crowds anymore. So maybe we charge less for our virtual events, and so that creates a difference in our sort of operation for the year. So those are all times where it might be really helpful to have an operating reserve in place. I also often kind of refer to this as like an internal line of credit. So I don't know if any of you have like a line of credit with a bank or another financial institution, but with lines of credit, we often borrow money when that checking account gets low, and then when that payment we're expecting comes in, we repay it to the bank, and that's a great tool that we can use to manage cash flow. When we are borrowing money, though, we have to pay interest when we have that money sitting in our account. So one of the benefits of having an operating reserve versus having to use a bank line of credit, or maybe even to supplement a bank line of credit, is that we are using our own money, and so that we don't have to pay an external organization to use that money. So if you get to the point where you are able to create a reserve that's big enough to help you do that work, you're going to save some money at the end of the day as well, because you're not paying interest on that reserve money. Okay, so an operating reserve, I would say, is kind of like, if you don't have an operating reserve, that is like that's maybe the first thing you could focus on, because that's going to help you get through those really emergent situations. Now we get to the fun stuff, the fun reserves. So another type of reserve that we talk about is an opportunity reserve. And so once you've got some cash in your operating reserve, you might think about creating another reserve. And this is maybe more like the rainy day fund type reserve that folks talk about, where you have some cash available to create something new, to develop a new program, to test something out, to respond to an opportunity in community. Basically it would be funds around that you could either use to kind of be there like when you need it, when you want to respond quickly, or it could be a reserve that you're building over a few years to like, we're building up reserves so that we can try program X in a few years. That is another sort of way you could do it. So I see a question here from David. So an operating reserve, should cover 1 month of operating expenses, 3 months, 12 months? That's a great question. It's always the first question. And I have a very unsatisfying answer for you, perhaps. It's that it really depends. So there is no one size fits all solution for nonprofits because we're all, we all have different budgets, we all have different operating needs. I would say if there is like a baseline, like best practice, 1 payroll. So could you keep the lights on? Could you keep operations going? Could you keep your staff intact for 1 payroll, maybe 2 payrolls, maybe a month or 2 of operating expenses? And then once you get to that point, figure out what would be most beneficial for your organization. Depending on, maybe you identify by doing some like cash flow analysis that you always need like 3 months. Like you always have 3 months where you go negative, and that is the right fit for your organization. So that would be your starting goal to reach for. The other thing, and we'll talk about this later, is that really the only way to build up reserves is to have surpluses in our operations. And so we also need to be really realistic about creating our reserves. If you have 0 money in reserves right now, you have to think about how long it would take to generate surplus to create a reserve. So if you are an organization that regularly has large surpluses, maybe creating a reserve is pretty easy. But if you're really kind of running very slim margins, which many nonprofits do because we have a lot of reimbursing contracts that just don't pay extra money, it might take a lot longer to build a reserve. So really determining sort of what is like the first need, what is the first guidepost or stop that you'd like to save for, and then keep building on that as you move forward. That was kind of a long answer, but it also feeds into this idea that so we can create an operating reserve and we can use it for that one specific purpose. And then we can have the opportunity to create other reserves as well if things are going great. So let's say we've filled up our opportunity reserve to the sort of goal that we've created. Now we set our sights on an opportunity reserve so that we can not only know that we have operating cash for X amount of months, but we can start that new program that we'd like to start in, let's say, 2 years. So thinking about that, this kind of like next level of reserve, what are some things that you might do in your organization with an opportunity reserve? And you can feel free to add those in the chat. I know that a lot of organizations really, we think of it or use it as like a kind of like an R&D fund. Like we really want to try something new, but we need some startup funds to do that. And there's not always a grantor around that wants to fund a startup or a new untested program. So if we're able to fund that ourselves, there's a lot more flexibility. Okay, so we've got our operating reserve. We've created an opportunity reserve. What might come next? How about some change capital? So what do nonprofits love to do? We love strategic planning. We love to have big grand plans about how we're going to change the world. But one of the things we often don't think about is how we are going to pay for those plans. And this is one of the ways we can do that. So creating a change capital reserve would be kind of a pot of money that you can spend on significant program changes, maybe a significant business model change, like overhauling IT or other systems, building some new infrastructure. So this would be like big time changes in your organization. So this also, sort of like the opportunity reserve, gives you the ability to spend money before that revenue comes in. So like we might have some like super grand plans in our new strategic plan, but they're not really going to churn money for like 3 years. So how are we going to support that program? until it really does start to make money. And this is the type of money that we could have in reserve to help support that type of program. It might also be like, you know, I think one of the things about like the change capital reserve too is like, let's say you are the recipient of one of those like big time, one-time gifts. You're getting Mackenzie Scott money. You're getting, you're getting a big grant that was completely unexpected to the organization. Like the first thing we ask is like, oh my gosh, what are we gonna do with all this money? Like that has never been a problem for our nonprofit, is how do we spend it all? Well, you could also put that money in your change capital reserve and make a plan. So you can sit on it, you can use it, it can feed the program that you are dreaming of, the program you've dreamt of, but you need a little time to like get it started, get it moving. Okay. Again, just if anyone wants to share, is feeling really inspired, in your organization, how would you use a change capital reserve, or what are the types of projects you might have coming up that could benefit from a fund like that? Feel free to share in chat. Okay, and then this is the more practical of the reserves. So we've got operations reserve, we've got the operational reserve, change capital, we've got kind of the vision for the future. If you own a building, really probably the number one, or like right next to your operational reserve, your payroll reserve, you're going to want your repair and replacement reserve. So as if you own a building, or maybe if you don't want to own the building, how expensive it is to own a building. And so part of being a building owner is, boilers break, roofs kind of run out of their serviceable lifetime. We have to remodel or bring things up to code at some point. And so unless we have some cash available for those repairs and replacements or upgrades, we're gonna have to finance, we're gonna have to put it off. Deferred maintenance gets very expensive. And so, excuse me, press the wrong button. If you have a significant amount of capital assets, so you do have the building, you do have like a fleet of vehicles or something like that, it's really important to put some money aside, perhaps to fund depreciation on those assets, to build a reserve for when those bills do come down the line. Financing can be a great option for some big capital projects like that, but also when when the boiler goes out, it's also very great to be able to just pay cash for that repair. So this would be, not everybody needs a repair and replacement reserve necessarily, but especially if you're a building owner or you have like that big amount of material assets, this is really something to think about, putting at the top of your priority levels. How many building owners do we have? You can raise your hand or go and chat. Yeah. Do you have building reserves? Kind of, yes, good, okay, great. Fund depreciation, we have a great video on that. Sheila, do you want to share the depreciation video? And that's a whole nother like hour-long discussion though, so I'm not gonna get into the weeds of depreciation. But again, this one's really, really important. Okay, and then this is kind of the last type of reserve I'll mention. And this would be for long-term mission reserve. So this is cash that you could invest on a longer time horizon. This is maybe one of those reserves that really helps you create like the durability and like age an organization with a long life. Maybe the purpose is, maintaining a long-term commitment, so you're getting like funds in that folks wanted you to have in reserve for a long time. It might be endowment-like in structure, and I know Jordan and I were kind of talking shop before this, and it sounds like this is really the nature of many of the endowments held by the community foundation. But it really, it's a longer-term investment. It can earn some money perhaps, and it really helps prepare for uncertainty or volatility. So just a different type of organization. And then one thing to kind of like remember is that just that, you know, when we talk about endowments or we talk about sort of long-term gifts or long-term investments, there's a couple things to keep in mind. One is the intention of the donor. So the donor intends it to be a permanently restricted gift. That's a much harder money to access than an unrestricted gift that you can put into reserve. And then also to think about some of the, you know, if you are going to invest it, you know, what some of the boundaries might be or restrictions might be on as far as like time. Like, do you get a CD? Do you invest in stocks and bonds and that kind of stuff? What is sort of the time horizon that you might use some of this money? It's also something to think about as far as how you invest a longer term mission reserve. Okay, so we talked about all of these different categories or pots of money over the last few minutes. So working capital, remember, this is not the reserve. This is just the cash that you need to operate every year. Then we talked about having an operating reserve. This is like the few payrolls or a few months of operating cash. We talked a little bit about having an opportunity or a risk reserve fund so that we can maybe act on opportunities that come up, having a little bit more flexibility with cash in a reserve like that. When we think about change capital, we're thinking about how do we fund like our big hopes and dreams? How do we fund the big changes that we're talking about in our strategic plan? Repair and replacement, very important for those of you that own buildings or other material amounts of capital assets. And then finally, the last one we talked about was that long-term mission reserve. And this might be a longer term investment or something that looks sort of like an endowment. Okay. So we kind of asked some of these questions along the way, and this is kind of what we're going to get into in the second part of our time together, is just kind of determining what kind of reserves do you want or need? How do you get to the point where you can have reserves? And so this slide is actually a really great like worksheet for your board or your finance committee or maybe your executive committee when you're starting to have or continue to have conversations about reserves in your organization. So these are some great questions to kind of ask to get some agreement on, because there might be, you know, differing opinions in your leadership about what type of reserve we should focus on first or how much we really need. And so here's some great questions. Sort of what's your starting point? Are you starting at zero? This is a brand new dream that we have that we're gonna act on, or do we already have the start of something and we're gonna build from that? Really important to understand your financial position. So what are the strengths and the weaknesses of where you're at right now? Have you been running a lot of deficits year over year? It's going to be harder to kind of turn that around to get to the point where you're creating surplus so that you can create reserves. But really understanding sort of what your financial position is and has been over the last few years can really help inform and help you answer some of these questions. Is there a problem you're solving? So one problem might be like, well, we don't have 1 month of payroll in reserve, and that would be something that could be really helpful for us if we, for some reason, need it. Maybe the problem is we would like to buy a building in the next 5 years, and we would like to create, you know, a down payment, or we would like to have some money set aside to buy all new furniture once we get there. Maybe it's the problem is we approved a strategic plan 3 years ago that we could not pay for. And so we have a new strategic plan coming up that we want to figure out how to fund. Or, you know, the work of the strategic plan anyway. That's one of the things I love about Propel is that we are just a bunch of finance nerds sitting around doing this work. And so if you do a strategic plan with us, you will always have a financial plan as part of your strategic plan. You need to have both. You really do. Also talking about what's the purpose of the reserve fund. So like, it's great, you know, I would love to talk to, I know I talked about like Harvard before, but like, what are they going to do with billions of dollars in reserve? Like, they're just like earning more money to earn more money. If you don't have a Harvard-sized reserve, what's the purpose of your reserve funds? Is it to fund those emergency times? Is it to pay for a new roof in 15 years? Is it to hire some new staff members over the next few years as you get a program ramped up. Like, what really is the purpose of the goal? And that will also help you inform, or that question helps you inform the how much do we need in reserve as well. What are we really going to use it for? What's the vision? And then you can start to put numbers to that. What's the purpose, or excuse me, when and how would the fund be used? So that's kind of like thinking about maybe the short term, like a cash reserve versus that longer term investment reserve. How quickly do you need access to cash or to that money? And then finally, the how much question. And I think oftentimes we start with the how much question. We're like, well, we need to have $100,000 endowment, or a 500 or $2 million endowment. And that's just like a number we've chosen. But once you answer some of these questions and you figure out what are the problems we're trying to solve, what is it we're trying to pay for, what's the purpose, coming to a better answer about how much is needed, it comes just a bit more naturally. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about that, the goal. What is the goal? So one of the things that I've mentioned a few times is kind of where do we have what we need to make a reserve happen? And so I like this image of someone planting seeds, because if for example you are an organization that's maybe been cutting into your cash over the last few years with some deficit spending, which may have been planned, maybe it was pandemic related, unexpected. Maybe you have a lot of empty pots that you feel like you need to fill. But you might have these seeds and you're ready to kind of figure out the way forward. How do we plant these seeds? What do these seeds need to survive? And so, some of that part of setting your goal is really, what do we have? Where have we been? Where do we want to head? So answering some of those strategic questions. Part of that, again, is setting that goal for how much we want in our reserves. And I mentioned this earlier when David asked the question of like, so how much? It really depends on what the purpose is. So there are some organizations that want 90 days cash on hand at all times. And that has, I think, in the industry become somewhat of a best practice, but we don't necessarily follow that, because we also have huge nonprofits where that would just be a ridiculous amount of money that you couldn't even insure from the FDIC standpoint, right? Like, you get big healthcare organizations, like putting that much in reserve and a cash is like, that's not even a good business practice. But figuring out for your organization what's really smart. Maybe you are on like a weird grant cycle where you get funding for 2 years and then you don't get funding for a year. And then, and that's like the reapplication phase. And then you get funding for 2 years and then you're off for a year. So maybe it is a year. Maybe you need a year of operating funds saved up. Who knows? But again, figuring out as an organization how much you need. So what are some questions we could ask to help us determine that amount specifically? So this is great. This is another, I think, good kind of like worksheet that you can sit down with if you really are starting at, thinking about this for the first time. This is something great to sit down with your executive director and your finance person or your treasurer, your finance committee, and just kind of like think about some of these things. So determining how much we need. So what expenses would we like to be covered in this? What's our average monthly spend? What's our annual budget, right? What are the fixed expenses? How long is our lease? Do we need to buy out our lease at some point if something crazy happens? What are activities that are flexible or tied to funding? So like if this funding dried up, then you might have a pot of expenses that dry up as well. So these are just like kind of all the interconnections of your business operation. Another great thing to do is to look at your last few budgets and see how reliable they were or how accurate they were. So are you really good at budgeting? Maybe you're budgeting for a surplus of X every year, but you end up with a deficit of a few $1,000s. Or maybe you are always under budgeting income. And so you're always sort of planning for just like maybe a little tiny surplus, but really when you look back at the history, you're getting a big surplus each year. So kind of figuring out like, how are we doing with budgeting? Is it going well? Are we good at it? Do we need to revisit our budgeting process as part of this project? You can also think about how your organization has been able to respond in the past to like big shocks to the system. I still feel like the last recession was like yesterday because, you know, I tend to have like a little bit of like nonprofit scarcity mindset sometimes. And so like, I remember where I was and how the funding responded and what happened and how we did that. And so looking at how your organization was able to respond to the last recession or those, you know, the first month or two of COVID that like everything shut down and we need to figure something out quickly. How did that go for you? That could also inform how much money you might need to have in reserve. And so part of that is like looking back and seeing how we've been able to handle these situations in the past, and then also kind of look forward and see what do we know about the next year that we might need to plan for. And so, you know, everyone's been saying the inflation word, everyone's been saying the recession word. What are some steps that we might need to take in our organization, or what are some possible areas that are affected by either of those things that we need to be thinking about? Then we want to figure out how much money we need, how much is adequate. So again, thinking about all these things, what are our short-term goals and plans? Is our short-term goal right now to just like keep the doors open? Is it to hire back staff? Is it to, you know, pick up some programs that were set down during the pandemic? Is it to get that strategic plan finished? Like, what are some goals that we have? What kind of goals are we looking at in our strategic plan? So if you know, are in the midst of, you're in year 2 of a 5-year plan, what do you need to accomplish in the next few years to have that be a successful plan? And then what kind of gaps are there? So are there things that we're visioning for the future that are not yet funded, right? Are there opportunities that we see ahead? Like maybe we've been talking to a partner about expanding a program or combining efforts on something. How much money is that going to cost us? Or how much money is it going to bring in? Because that could also be a source of revenue to fund your reserve. And then these last 2 questions kind of go back to what we just talked about is, so how likely is the need to access the reserves quickly or within a certain time period real? And how much risk are you able to accept? And so risk can come in a lot of different forms. You could create a budget that says you're going to have a $300,000 surplus. It's all going to go into reserve. You're just going to create your operation reserve next year. But if you have a history of $1,500 surpluses, getting a $300,000 surplus is going to be, well, it seems like it would be very hard. That feels like a really big swing. Unless you have a donor set up that's going to give you that $300,000 that goes straight into your reserve, right? So if you were to create this budget that is totally different than the last few years that you've seen, that to me is very risky. Are there other things? Are you going to go out and spend a bunch of money to start something in hopes that you'll make that money you need to fill your reserve? And then what if it flops? That's kind of risky too. So thinking about risk from different angles and thinking about what's acceptable to you is an important question to ask as part of this process. All right, so we've talked a little bit about the goals, the sort of figuring out sort of what our needs are. Now we talk about what's our starting point. And again, this might be the first conversation you have as you're figuring out like, okay, do we need reserves? Or do we already have them and we don't realize it? That seems sort of unlikely, but you know, maybe that's the answer to the question. Are you starting from scratch? Is this you're going to open a savings account next week after this webinar and you're going to start a reserve fund? Or do you have one or more reserves already that you're going to build on and maybe think a little bit more strategically about? Or are you in this position where maybe you did get a special one-time gift during COVID, maybe some relief funds or something like that, where you do have some funds just sitting around that you want to be strategic with. And that brings us to a poll where I would love to hear how you are all thinking about sort of where your organization is right now. So you should see the poll up on your screens now. I do. Feel free to choose one of the selections and then click submit, and we'll be able to tally up our votes together. Are you getting any results, Sheila?
Yeah, we have
Okay.
28.
Excellent. I'm used to being like the co-host and I can see the status of like how things are going. I'm just gonna reach behind myself real quick and grab my footstool, and I will be right back here in just a second.
Okay. We have about 10 more people who can still respond if you haven't yet.
Okay.
What do you think here? Should we close it?
Let's do it. Let's see what the people have spoken about. Okay, so looks like you should all be able to see this, but we've got about 9% of folks on the call today that have no reserve funds. About 57% of the organizations have cash available as reserves, but you need to do a little bit more strategic thinking about those reserves. That's a great place to be. That is so exciting. I'm so excited for you all. And then another 31% of you have reserve funds and you have decided when and how to use them. I don't know why you're all here today. You've got it going on. This is great news. And then a few of you are unsure of whether you have reserve funds or not. That's cool. But generally speaking, like over 98% of, well, no, that's 90, 97, 98% of you have some reserve funds, and it's really just a matter of figuring out how to use them, how to be strategic, maybe to do a little bit more thinking around structure. And some of you already have it all going on, so that's great. I'm very excited for all of you. Thank you. Thanks for sharing. That's great. Okay, so you might be sitting here thinking like, okay, but what do I need, right? So like maybe you're in that boat where you have some funds available, but you're not quite sure how to like cordon them off and talk about them with your community or with your organization. So really, realistically speaking, what do we need? So all nonprofits need working capital. We need to have some cash to pay the bills, to pay our people, to meet our obligations. Like that's just a given. Most organizations would benefit from operating reserves. So the kind of more emergency funds, opportunity reserves, or change capital. So that long-term or longer term sort of like realizing your dreams pot of money. And then some of you or some organizations will need repair and replacement reserves. Again, if you own a building or have a material amount of capital assets, or that long-term investment. So that can be beneficial to some organizations. It might not be beneficial to all organizations though, especially if the more emergent need is to build operating reserves. Like you don't want to stow that away in an investment that you can't access. Okay, let's talk about accumulating reserves. Our executive director always shares this cartoon because it's like, okay, they've got this like equation, this is the plan, this is what we want to do, then a miracle occurs and like all of a sudden we have operating reserves, right? Yeah, I think we need to talk a little bit more about step 2. Let's do that for a few minutes. How do we build the reserve fund? Okay, So what might be some sources of reserve funds? So the most common, I would say, in nonprofit organizations that I work with at least, is just the incremental accumulation from operating surpluses, which means you are bringing more money into the organization than you're spending. If we have like lots of unplanned deficits where we're kind of eating into our cash year over year, it is nearly impossible to create operating reserves or reserves of any kind, because there's none available, right? So we need to get really good at budgeting and really good at managing expenses, so that if our goal is to have a surplus of X each year or certain years to add to the reserve fund, that we're able to achieve that. And you know what, the other thing is that sometimes you're going to have planned deficits, especially those years where you're going to access your reserves and spend some of that money. But we also need to be really thoughtful about how we're going to build those reserves or rebuild those reserves. And I will talk a little bit more about that in a few slides. Another source of reserve funds could be designating all or part of the windfall donation that you receive to a reserve. I know I keep talking about Mackenzie Scott money, but like, she just gives out big chunks of money. So if you've got a Mackenzie Scott check, maybe you take 3/4 of it and you put it into reserve, or maybe you create all of these reserves from her one gift, right? It's sort of a once in a lifetime windfall opportunity. Sometimes you might be in a position where you are able to apply for a special grant or matching funds to start a reserve fund. Not all foundations want to fund your savings account, but some might. And that's a great opportunity to take advantage of if it arises. And then finally, I'm seeing a lot of nonprofits now that are building sort of reserve funds or savings funds into fundraising or capital campaigns. So it's like a capital campaign for capital to keep on hand in the organization, to invest in the organization. And so that can be a really smart way to kind of add that into the mix as well, if you're trying to build a reserve fund. And maybe, quickly, if the need is we need reserve funds in the next year or two, having a dedicated campaign to that could be a good option for you as well. So we talked about the committing to an annual surplus. So again, if we want to build a reserve fund, or have some extra cash on hand just for to bridge your cash flow ups and downs, to make sure you have enough working capital around, you want to have an annual surplus. This again is not to say that having planned deficits is a bad thing. It's not. There are going to be times where we strategically invest and spend down some of the money we've saved. But if you are, if you're always surprised at the end of the year that you're running a deficit instead of a surplus, take a look at your budgeting process again and see really how that's going, because you might need to make a few changes to your budget or your operating process if you're getting surprised by deficits year over year. If you're an organization that does have capital assets that depreciate, making sure that you're funding depreciation can be an excellent way to build a cash reserve fund. So I know that we shared depreciation can be kind of a tricky concept if you're not familiar with it, but it's the cost of using an item over its usable life. And usually it's like a building or expensive computer equipment or cars that are more expensive. But instead of just letting those items depreciate and never sort of putting money back in reserve to buy new ones, if we're funding depreciation, if we're setting aside money each month that matches that depreciation expense in our organization, you just like magically create a reserve fund for yourself. So that's a great opportunity as well. I often encourage folks, and these all kind of like go together, the last three, including operating reserves into your annual budget. So if it's kind of hard to like envision just like having a surplus and then putting it into reserve, create a line item in your budget for it. because that will help you really figure out what that realistic number is. Maybe the first year it's $1,200, $100 a month. Maybe the next year it's $5,000. Maybe the next year it's $20,000. So making it part of your budgeting process can also be really helpful in achieving those goals of setting aside reserves. Along with that, making sure you're establishing realistic goals is really important, because again, if you're an organization that has been running maybe like pretty much break even, or you've had small deficits, it's going to be really hard to all of a sudden create a $500,000 surplus or a $500,000 reserve next year, unless you know you have that special $500,000 gift coming in to specifically fund your reserve. So I think often it can be the job of nonprofit staff members to really set the tone around that. I think board members tend to demand like, well, we need 90 days operating cash. Okay, cool. If you look at our cash flow projection, you can see that we operate at $10,000 per month. And so in order to have a 90-day reserve, we need to have $30,000 in reserve. And last year we had a $2,500 surplus. So how many years of $2,500 surpluses is it going to take to build up $30,000? That's a lot. So again, just like being realistic about what it takes to build reserves, and then really trying to go after those goals. But again, make them realistic, you know? One of the things that I always suggest too, and this is how, you know, we talk about cash reserves, generally speaking, accumulate in increments. Well, think about it from like a personal finance standpoint. So I remember when I was first out of college, had my first job, I automatically sent $50 out of every paycheck to a savings account. And that doesn't seem like much, but I didn't make a lot right out of college. And I knew that I needed to have some sort of fund on hand. Like if I had a medical bill, if I had a car, you know, my car broke down. And so I never even saw that money. I just sent it right to the savings account from my paycheck. And so if you're an organization that's maybe having a hard time kind of like getting started with the practice of saving money for a reserve account, sending some money each month over to a savings account or some sort of reserve account can be a really helpful practice, instead of just like saying like, yeah, in December we'll do it. You know, we'll send $5,000 in December. That's what we said we do. Sending a few $100s each month is going to be just easier to get used to. And then you've developed this practice of regular savings. Plus, then you can go up from there. So let's say you do decide that, okay, we're going to transfer $500 a month into reserve. And that feels really easy. Maybe then next year it's $750 or $1,000. So, or a lot more than that. I don't know any of your budget sizes at the moment, but you know, just thinking about like that, like from a personal finance, and when we have a goal to buy a new home or to buy a boat or to install new windows in our houses, you know, you have to set a goal, and then you have to incrementally set some money aside to reach that goal. Okay, this is when we talk a little bit about this. This slide may not be applicable to everybody, but when we talked a little bit about one of the ways to raise money for a capital or for a reserve account is to basically have a campaign, have a special fundraising campaign just to raise capital. And so again, I'm seeing this a lot with a lot of organizations, that instead of like the capital campaign for a building, they're having a capital campaign for capital. And you know, if you have that really, what's the word I'm looking for? If you have like a new strategic plan with a lot of ideas in it, a lot of new plans for the future, getting folks really excited about what you are looking to do over the next few years can raise excitement with your donors and with your community. And so, you know, if a fundraising campaign like this is something that you want to do, it can be a great opportunity to like get the community excited about your work, or get them re-excited about your work. And then also, you know, to just kind of be able to, this is going to be different than having an incremental reserve where you're saving money month by month. This is going to be, it's going to be like a capital campaign. You're going to track your success over a certain amount of time. You can really keep an eye on the funds that are coming in and how quickly they are. So this could be a really great opportunity, especially if you are looking to fund a specific type of reserve, or you're trying something new, you're responding to needs in the community, and then really asking the community to help fund that as well. Okay. So this is sort of the last part. So now let's assume that we have some reserve funds. So a few questions that we need to ask, and I know in our last poll there was definitely a group of folks that have reserves, but they're not quite sure what we're going to use them for. We're still kind of like thinking out some strategic vision around them. These are really great questions to ask. And this could be another worksheet. So like you can just print out these slides, bring them to your next finance committee meeting, have some big conversations about reserves. We've written the questions for you. So some questions to ask, especially for that group of like 31% of folks that are still kind of like getting everything firmed up. Are the funds that we have set as reserves really designated as reserves in our policies and procedures right now or not? Are the funds available in cash, or are they invested somewhere? Do we understand the purpose of the funds clearly? So that might be understanding what the donor, if for example, you raised money from donors specifically to fill that reserve, like, do you understand the donor intent? Are you in a position to understand how to spend it properly without breaking any agreements with donors? What's the mechanism or the process that you need for using the funds? Do you have a policy and a procedure set up? And how will you communicate about reserves? So communicating could be like with your community. Maybe once you plan to spend down your reserves, you're going to show a few years of deficits. How do you explain that to your funders and to the community? How do you talk to your board about, getting into that mental space where like we need to create surplus to fill these reserves year over year? How do you talk about reserves with your staff? And then a big question behind this, I think, is, do you have a reserve policy, or do you need to create one or revise one? So that is something to keep in mind. We also have, I know it looks like Sheila shared our financial policy guidelines an example. We also have an example reserve policy as well. So if you are starting at zero, you don't have a reserve policy and you're looking to create one, or if your policy needs a revision, please take a look at that resource. And again, there's a template. So if you really just want to start with ours, go ahead, put your logo on it. Some things to think about, and these will be part of your policy. So when is the right time to use reserves? So this is both a policy question and like a strategic question. So when we decide the time is right to dip into our operating reserves, for example, this will probably be to manage a short-term cash flow problem. And part of using the money is having a plan to replenish that money. So we are going to always access the funds in June, July, and August, because we know that's what our business model looks like. And we will replenish those funds over the course of the year so that we're ready to use them again come next June. So having a plan to replenish the fund is important. The next reason we might use an operating reserve is to just manage unexpected financial problem. So there's a few ways to look at this. And one is, I'll answer the second question first. When's not the time to use reserves? It's to fill a budget hole that can't be replenished. So if you're just like, if you haven't looked back at your budgets, if you haven't figured out if you're good at budgeting or not, and you're just gonna like fill that hole that's always there, there's no way to replenish that reserve, because the hole is just gonna show up again. So really being mindful about what you're using the money for and how you're going to replenish it, especially with the operating reserve, because you're likely to access that one more frequently, is really important. If we have those unexpected financial problems that arise, again, we might not know exactly how we're going to replenish the fund, but we have some sort of plan to address the situation. Like, do you have a plan in place or some ideas about how you would respond if you lost your biggest funder? Or if all of a sudden, like in March 2020, when all of your ticket sales dried up because you had to close the theater. So thinking about some of those different situations and figuring out sort of like, what is our vision for replacing and replenishing the fund, and when should we use it? The other thing to note, and this is especially about operating reserves, because you may be accessing those funds more often than you would, for example, like the long-term strategic reserve. Having a policy about sort of how do we access those funds as an organization. So maybe there are some cases in which the drawing on that reserve requires full board approval. Maybe there are other situations, like to bridge a payroll or something during that time where you generally use it. The executive director could approve the draw, and then it's reported back to the board at their next meeting. So again, setting up kind of the rules and the parameters around the use of funds. Thinking about some of the other types of reserves. So like, when might we want to access our opportunity reserve? So again, we're thinking about using this money for a specific strategic purpose that we've determined through visioning process, through a strategic planning process. We might want to accomplish a goal, a specific goal with this money that has maybe a short, medium, or long-term horizon. But when is not the right time to use it? It's to fill the budget hole. We want to make sure that we are being strategic, and especially if we do have a goal that we want to accomplish, that we are tracking if we're actually accomplishing that goal or not. So if we just go start spending money willy-nilly and we're not actually sure if it's serving the purpose that we've laid out, that's kind of tough. That's a hard use of that money that you've worked so hard to save up. So again, we want to make sure we're being strategic and also tracking what does accomplishing this goal look like? How do we know if we've succeeded in meeting our goal to use this money? Part of this might also be developing a strategy around storytelling, because when we start spending our reserve funds, we're likely to show a deficit in our organization. And so if you're an organization that has a long history of surpluses, you've built up that big reserve, you might have to explain to your donors and to the community why you're now showing deficits after so many years of surpluses. And so of course, the reasons are, well, we built up this reserve after many years and we're using it to do this program. We've built up this program and we've hired these staff and we purchased this building. and now we're going to, we have more options available in community to serve you. But again, it might require a little bit of storytelling. We talked a little bit about this, but again, just making sure that you do have an approved policy from your board. It's really helpful to help manage these funds once we have them built up. So again, defining the purpose of your reserve fund, the intended use. Perhaps you have some sort of amount goal or target, a minimum amount that you'll have in reserve, or other sort of benchmarks. When we talked about that incremental build, maybe you have a year 1, a year 3, a year 5 goal for that reserve. And then again, how do we report and monitor that reserve? Is it report on and monitor the reserve? Is it something you talk about at the finance committee level? Is it something you mention at every board meeting? Is it something you add to a dashboard perhaps that you have? How are we going to keep an eye on that? And then the other thing is, if you have specifically an investment fund, you may also require an investment policy to accompany that. So I'm guessing that's something that Jordan knows a lot about, so you might have to reach out to him for investment policies. We don't have an example for that one specifically, but if you do have investments, having an accompanying policy can be really helpful for all the reasons we outlined about having a reserve policy as well. A few things to think about, again, as you are investing your reserves, really thinking about what your objectives are, what your goals are, how quickly you need to access money, thinking about your risk tolerance as far as investing that money is, and then also really kind of determining that timeline in which you might use some of those funds. So making sure that you have the right investment vehicle to fit when you need cash available to do the work you'd like to do. Okay. Ooh, I'm almost to the end of my slides. So we talked about kind of creating a storyline around using reserves, but the other thing we might want to tell a story about is this new money showing up on our balance sheet. So when you create a reserve, obviously your assets are going to increase. You're going to have more cash around or more investment around. And so there's a few things that we can do to show that. And so you might have a different message for your internal audiences versus your external audiences. But I've heard from so many organizations that say, well, my funder thinks I have all this cash on hand, and so they won't give me more money. And the story there is like, well, we still need operating cash. We are saving this money for a very specific purpose. So there are ways that you can display that on your financial reports that really show what all that cash is doing, sitting around on your balance sheet. So for example, when you think about, this is kind of like the bottom lines of a balance sheet, if you're familiar with a balance sheet. And one of the things you can do, because you own your financial reports and you can really have them look any way you'd like them to, you can break out your unrestricted net assets into unrestricted, so no restrictions here, and board designated. So let's say your reserve is board designated, or let's say you have an endowment with the Greater Des Moines Community Foundation, right? You can also show that on your balance sheet and be very specific and show what that looks like and how it affects your assets. If that might fall into temporarily restricted assets, depending on how you classify it. Again, question for auditors and CPAs, that I'm not one of those. But from a storytelling perspective, there are ways to show the different pots of money that we have on our balance sheet and be really specific, not just like checking, savings, and that's it, right? Like we can add a little bit more detail to our financial statements as well. And let's say you have more than one reserve, you can be specific. You can have an operating reserve, an opportunity reserve, and a program reserve, or an operating reserve and a building reserve. So again, that is like a very quick and easy way to explain to people, mostly funders, where your money is and what it's doing for you. Okay, so we've talked about all these different types of reserve funds. There will be no quiz, but remember, there's a few different ones. We all need working capital. We probably all need some operating reserve. And then the rest of these, the opportunity, the change, the repair and replacement long term, those are what sort of comes next after you've created kind of your operating or emergency reserve. So we have one more poll here. So what is, thinking about all of the information that you've just taken in over the last 75 minutes, which next step do you think is needed to address your organization's reserve needs? So defining the type of reserves, creating policies, or maybe revising them, engaging in some planning to figure this stuff out, creating a realistic plan to build your reserves, figuring out some risks or opportunities. I'm not sure, or if you have like a whole list of things, feel free to share that in the chat as well. So I I'm just going to give you a preview. I have 2 slides left for you all. And if anyone's been coming up with big questions, it's just about time to unleash those. So we have about 15 minutes left in our time together. Jordan, do you need any wrap up time, or should we go right up to 1:30 if there's questions?
We can go maybe to 1:29. I'll take 1 minute of wrap up time.
Excellent. Good to know. Okay, great. So we have there's a pretty even division between all of these different tasks. So it looks like you all are going to go back to your office with different types of homework, which is very exciting. I will just encourage you again to, Jordan will share these slides with you. So if part of this is like having some of these conversations, like print out the slide, copy and paste into a Word document, bring those questions to your next committee meeting, look up some of the resources we've shared. And if after you've done all that, you still have questions, always feel free to reach out to us. I know that Jordan will share my contact information as well as sort of like general, some of my, our contact list as well at Propel. So I would be remiss if I didn't mention just one last thing. And so I've mentioned business model a few times during our time together. And if you're familiar with the terminology, so business model is really thinking about how we utilize resources, how we bring resources into our organization, and how we use them to achieve our mission, to keep going, all that stuff. One thing to mention is that all of these different pieces of our business model, so the revenue mix, how much our programs cost, what sort of infrastructure we have, what our capital structure is, usually this turns really fun, like gears, but it's not working today, of course. But you can envision all these different pieces are kind of grinding together. And if you change one of them, it's gonna change things a little bit. And so let's say you buy a new building, or you do get like a $10 million gift to create a reserve. This cog is going to get way bigger, and it's going to change how everything else operates. And so when we make big changes to parts of our business model or parts of our operations, it's just important to remember to like keep track of the other things going on. So if you, for example, if part of your big strategic plan is to change the way you raise money, maybe you're going to go from individual donations to earned income. That might change the infrastructure you need, or the type of capital assets that you need to have on hand. If you are going to start a new program, that is certainly going to affect the revenue in your organization. Maybe it will create more revenue. Maybe it'll be a bigger drain on your revenue. So again, just like kind of being mindful of the symbiotic relationship that we have in our organizations, where if you do end up with like these big pots of money, which I hope you do, just being mindful about how they might change the rest of the organization, because they operate all very closely together. And if you're a business model nerd, I think we do have some business model trainings coming up as well at Propel, which you should totally sign up for if that's something you're into. So that is all I have. And I will open it up for questions. I see a question in the chat that I'll answer first. And then if anyone wants to unmute and use their voice, I will welcome that as well. But Alex writes, do you recommend holding reserve funds in an investment account or in a bank account? So that is a good question. It's also going to go back to questions that you have to answer as an organization. So what is the goal of that reserve? When do you need to access it? How do you need to access it? So, if you have let's say you have that like one payroll on hand and you think you might have to access it a few times a year, cash is probably going to be the way to go, because you're going to have to jump through a lot of hoops to access an investment account to pay for one payroll. But if you have that longer term reserve, or maybe you're planning to use it in a few years and you can have some cash that can sit around and earn some money for you, then an investment account could be a great vehicle for that money as well. So it really kind of depends on how you'll use it, how often, how quickly you need to access it at any given time. Other questions? Feel free to use the chat or again, unmute if you'd like to.
Sarah, one question that I had, you mentioned the reserve policy and you shared your template for that and mentioned that investment policy is something to be discussing as well. You don't have a template for, which is understandable. Do you see those two policies being, I don't know if collaborative is the right word, but would it make sense to have maybe one combined policy that covers both, or do you feel like those need to be two separate things?
So in my in my perfect nerdy world, I would have a binder, a 3-ring binder that has your general financial policies and procedures in it, your reserve policies and procedures in it, and then your investment portfolio, or your investment policies and procedures. They might all be part of one file. They might all live in one folder on your server, but they definitely will likely refer to each other and be symbiotic together, like this, our business model cogs. I don't think that you could write one policy like in a silo, absent the other two. So I think they'll definitely work together. Whether it just needs to be one big financial policy, I think having some separation and just kind of honoring like this is for operations, this is for reserves, and this is for investments is helpful, especially when you think about like who's the audience for those policies. Well, it's new staff coming in and learning about how the operation works, and new board members coming in and learning how the operation works. And so having a bit of division between those 3 policies, I think, can also make it a little less overwhelming. Good question. What else?
And regarding Lynn's question in the chat, we'll send a follow-up email in the next couple of days, and we'll have some resources in there for you as well.
Cool. Well, I've never been mad at ending a webinar a few minutes early. So if there are no other questions, Jordan, I'll throw it back to you, but I'll also just offer to folks, if you're doing something, you're getting a snack in a few minutes after the webinar, and you're like, oh, this was my question. Feel free to send me an email. I'd be happy to answer it offline.
Well, Sarah, thank you so much. We really appreciated the time with you. I think there was a lot of engagement and interest and curiosity that was spiked there, and I'm sure we'll have a lot of questions as we get our snacks after this as well. I saw Sheila had posted in the chat some upcoming trainings at Propel. I'd encourage you all to check out those. I know I've attended a few of those myself and can attest that it's a really valuable educational experience there. We also have a few upcoming events ourselves, and I'll put those in the chat too. And 2 that are coming up here, you got this fall, one September 12th on resiliency and fundraising, and another September 27th on board for board members. Both of those might be a good part 2 to the conversation we had today. So we'd encourage you to check out both of those as well. I mentioned at the very beginning, Give DSM. I'd encourage you again to check that out after this if you haven't already. Maybe you found in the last hour and a half that posting to Give DSM to promote building a reserve fund might be a solution for you among the other fundraising opportunities there as well. So you have our contact information. Like I said, we'll follow up with a follow-up email after this as well. And we just want to thank you again for joining us.